Hello and welcome to another episode of Global Youth's podcast. Today we have someone very special with us, Mr. Dhruva Jaishankar. So, Dhruva Jaishankar is the Executive Director of ORF America, the US arm of Observer Research Foundation. He's not just a foreign policy expert, but someone who has been at the heart of some of the most strategic conversations happening in and around India. In this episode, we'll be unpacking the evolution of India's foreign policy through the arcs of history and strategy, from Pandit Nehru's non-alignment to Mr. Modi's aspirational leading power vision. And as global power centers shift and the Indo-Pacific heats up, what does India's balancing act look like between autonomy, partnership, and assertiveness? We'll explore how India's strategic thinking has responded to global changes, from the Cold War and US unipolarity to China's rise, and what Atmanirbhar Bharat, Act East, and Thinking West truly signify in today's multipolar world. Can India convert historical caution into strategic leadership? We'll talk about all of that, but also dip a bit in journey of Mr. Jaishankar, who shaped his what has shaped his thinking, who has shaped his thinking, and how India is navigating this new, fast changing global order. So, thank you so much for joining us, sir. It is a real honor for us to be hosting you.
Yep. Thank you, sir. So, sir, before we start off, there's a lot of things, as Vaishu mentioned, we're going to cover, and a lot of chaos going on in the international arena that we'll talk about. But before all of that, I wanted to sort of have a more sober starter, and I wanted to begin with something that's personal, sir. So, you've grown up around diplomacy. Your father was one of our nation's, India's top diplomats, and now is the Honorable External Affairs Minister. Even your grandfather was an Indian civil servant and a secretary to the government of India. So, I want to know, what was it like, growing up in this atmosphere? Did you always want to work in international affairs, or was it that, was it some event that happened and you sort of discovered your path later?
Yeah, so the short version of that is I did not always want to go into the world of international affairs. In fact, I didn't study it until, I mean, it was really only after university for me. So I was 22 when I started working in this area. I studied history as an undergraduate, something which I still sort of use a lot actually in my day-to-day life, surprisingly. But in fact, it was almost the opposite. It was because my grandfather worked in that field that I almost did not want to go into that. I didn't express much of an interest. That being said, I realized later that a lot of things came quite intuitively to me. We were always talking about in the news. My grandfather always had, the radio on or the TV on, or, had stacks of newspapers that he would read every day. So, I grew up, and then I also grew up in many different parts of the world, in India, of course, but also in the US, in Europe, in Japan. So I sort of experienced like different cultures, different mindsets growing up. So in hindsight, a lot of that became useful for me later, but it wasn't as if I had an interest until I was quite a bit older, until really it was only after I was about 22 or so that I embarked upon this path. And it was due to a number of things. I mean, I think I actually wanted to be a journalist. That was partly and sort of accidentally in some ways fell into the world of public policy. I think there were also opportunities that opened up because, frankly, some of what I do now was just those opportunities were not there 30 years ago. So it was hard to even say like I want to do X when that did not exist. That aspiration. Today, some of those opportunities are available. So I think some of that opened up over time. But the idea that I always wanted to do this is not the case at all.
Yes. So as you say that many of the things, they came intuitively to you. So it's we can probably conclude and say that this was in your genes, and maybe as you grew up, it awakened.
And slightly accidental. I mean, I have a sister and a brother who don't work on international relations at all. They have zero interest in it. They work in very different fields. And so I'm not sure it's just that, but I do think, again, in hindsight, some things benefit. I think mostly the fact of growing up around the world, growing up I would say another interesting thing I should mention is, strangely, we grew up around politics in a way because lived in political capitals, whether it was in Delhi or other capitals, but always with a strange like arm's length distance as observers uh, of politics. In a very strange way, so I grew up in a very apolitical background, which is not sort of as an interested observer, but always as an observer rather than a participant. So it's very interesting now that my father's in sort of a cabinet level in a political position. People sort of assume that there was a sort of political background, and actually we grew up in a very apolitical environment.
Indeed, sir. So it was a bureaucratic environment, and definitely bureaucrats are expected to be non-political during their careers. So it's understandable. And sir, so son, once you joined this career, you've worked in various different positions. You've been associated with various organizations. Right now, with the Observer Research Foundation, and played a pivotal role to sort of establish that in America. So there are many nations that you've stayed in, you've worked in. So, was there any particular experience or certain turning point during your career, or even before that, that sort of shaped your worldview, and it continues to have a deep impact on you and the way you perceive anything? Uh,
Yeah, so I think even before I started, when I was still in university or school, a few things happened that were big. Again, in hindsight, one was India's nuclear tests of 1998. In some ways, that was a time, sometimes initially for the wrong reasons, that the world sort of took an interest in India after a long time. The 1999 Kargil War, then 2001, the 9/11 attacks in New York, which suddenly made a lot of these issues global. So those were, that happened when I was in university. So, those events were quite pivotal in shaping my worldview. I'm a product in some ways of that generation that grew up then. The Kandahar hijacking of an Air India flight in '99. I mean, these were quite pivotal moments before my professional life in some ways. But I'd say I had a few phases. One is I moved to Washington after university in 2005, and just then India and the US had signed. We're approaching the 20th anniversary of that, actually, the civil nuclear agreement. And suddenly again that excited. There was not a lot of knowledge in the US about India, but suddenly there was more interest. And in some ways that sort of afforded me, I sort of dove into that world, which was like suddenly like explaining India to an American audience, and also explaining what's happening in US-India relations, because suddenly there's more excitement about that in India as well. The second thing is I worked for a few years under somebody named Stephen Cohen. He was an American who worked on India and Pakistan. And I learned a lot about India-Pakistan relations just from that. And in fact, that afforded me the possibility to interact a lot with Indian and Pakistani policymakers, which probably as an Indian, I would not have had that opportunity. This was 2007 to 9. So I learned a lot about some of also the limitations of a lot of that engagement. I'm much more skeptical, I think, of a lot of people about this Aman Ki Asha type spirit.
yes.
I sort of saw the limitations of that. Then I worked for a place called the German Marshall Fund on US-Europe relations. It brought me back. I'd studied Europe. I lived there for a while, so it brought me back into Europe a little bit, but also on some global, so what are some of the momentous changes? This was around the time of the global financial crisis and the aftermath, the Euro crisis. So that kind of broadened, to engage on some economic political economy issues as well, again, on a more global landscape. Then I moved back to India, and I worked for a place then called Brookings India. And that allowed me, actually, I think that for me, that was a very important thing, because it allowed me to help see the world from Delhi's perspective. I think a lot of people who sit outside of India think they can do that while, without actually, you have to get into the mindset of how does the world look if you're in Delhi, which is very different from how the world, people in Washington or other places may want India to behave in a certain way, but that's not, it doesn't take into account a whole range of, the importance of the neighborhood was very, this was during we had crisis with Nepal, Sri Lanka at that time. Even Afghanistan was difficult. So that was that came out. What was happening with the Quad in the Indo-Pacific, the Doklam standoff with China. So I was in Delhi for much of that. Then it was only then, because I was like, if a US linked entity can have an office in Delhi, why can't it be the other way around? And so I was very keen at some point. I mean, this idea had been brewing for some time, but after 15 years of working in this field, why should we not have an Indian affiliated think tank abroad? And the one place, I mean, the other, I've, again, had some experience in places like Singapore and UK and US and Europe, but Washington is still the policy capital in a way that sort of Wall Street again is the center for finance globally, Hollywood, for film, Silicon Valley for tech, so Washington still has, and so I was like, if we have to do it, we should do it in Washington, at least first, because it's the most competitive, it's the hardest to do it there. And it's in some ways it was a big challenge to take on, and something I'm glad now I did, but it was not always easy because we started doing it just as the COVID pandemic hit. And that was again very pivotal. So I don't want to belabor these issues and go into a lot of my own personal journey, but I think these were very important contributions to an outlook that sort of took shape over time. But both in this and in your previous question, what I would stress is we will look back and say that some things were done very deliberately with a lot of hindsight. The fact is, it's often a series of decisions that lead to a certain endpoint.
Indeed, sir. So I think that we can make out from your journey that one must sort of go with the flow. As you observe things, you should sort of make your mind up and take decisions. And so it starts out with how you started with this field. You observed your scenario. You wanted to be a journalist, but then you entered into this field, and then now you established an Indian think tank's office in sort of the epicenter of the free world, where major decisions are taken. So that I find that very inspiring, sir, and I'm sure that a lot of our viewers would be inspired in that. So, sir, now we would like to sort of move ahead and take our discussion towards your book and towards the historical arcs that you explore in your book, from ancient India to Nehru's India to the present day. So, Vaishu, I think you can take this discussion forward in that direction.
So, one of the core ideas in Vishwa Shastra is that India has always had a strategic position, from Continuum to maritime trade route. Why do you think this legacy was overlooked for so long, and how is it coming back today?
Yeah, so I wrote the book. I mean, I have a copy here, Vishwa Shastra, India and the World, and it came out last year in December. It's been published by Penguin India, so it's available in India only. One of the things I hope I can do is sort of get an international edition as well. And I wrote this almost complementary to what we were talking about before. I felt in addition to having an institution that is able to work on policy related to India and the world outside of India, it was important also to have a sort of starting point in the form of a book. That is something that for an average Indian, and particularly a young Indian trying to enter a career of international relations or international policy, that they should have a starting point. And because I felt a lot of people were not, a lot of this information was available, it was scattered in different places, but putting it together in one place. So the book does two things. One is it provides a history in about 200 pages or so of India's interactions with the world from ancient times to the present day. It ends in 2024. And then the last third of the book, last 150 pages or so, 100 pages, is about the strategy of the future. What are India's priorities today, and what is it working towards? This issue of strategic creation comes out a lot because I think we've been very influenced by a scholarship outside of India on India. There's nothing inherently wrong with that, but I think, of course, it sometimes brings in its own biases, and a lot of times, and this continues, by the way, unfortunately, when people are unable to discern a pattern or it doesn't make sense to them, they presume that there is no pattern, that there's no logic to behavior. So a lot of times, for example, when people say India doesn't have a strategy, it's because they are confused. It's because they don't understand, right? So unfortunately, I think we've been sort of somewhat beholden to that, and it hasn't resulted in sort of a dedicated application to understanding the sources of Indian strategic thought. And again, I think a very basic element of this, and it's not just with India, with any country, is you have to get into the mind of that place from that point of view. So what I tried to do in writing the book was go back. I go back, in fact, as far as Ashoka and the Mauryas, but actually even slightly, there's some antecedents even before that. And just look at what did the world look like from the point of view of successive Indian leaders in pre-independence India, and then much more detailed sort of after 1947. And what I try and say, like, what were the, I had to go into read everything that they had written, whether it was like Nehru, whether it was later leaders as well in India, but get into their mindset and then say, look, this is how they were facing often competing pressures to do things in different ways. They had a development objective or welfare objective at home that was often, again, from Ashoka to Nehru to Modi. I mean, there's one thing in common is that the number one priority is how do we better the livelihoods and progress of our country. That's number one. Number two, how do we secure country, from others? But sometimes what people do is they pay attention only to the rhetoric. So they'll hear like the lofty rhetoric, which is sometimes done for domestic political reasons. Sometimes it's done to assuage, to send a message to our other partners. But that is not the strategy. The strategy is the action. The look at what is being done more than what is being said. And I think I think most people will come away. I try not to show judgment very much. I try and evaluate what happened and in different. It doesn't. I don't think it comes across as saying every Indian leader was successful, but there was a logic and there was a worldview that sometimes was reflective of the time that guided those decisions. There wasn't a sort of absence of strategic thought. And so that I think is what the one feedback I've gotten from a lot of people who've read the book is that they're surprised that India has been pragmatic. The term that keeps coming, or some variation of it, that there's always been a pragmatism behind it, even if those decisions have not always, in hindsight, been the best decisions. They came from somewhere. So that's, I think, one thing I stress. But why is it? I think people haven't done the homework to. I'm actually just starting on another, what may end up being a short book on sort of more ancient Indian grand strategy, and it's requiring me to go back and read original texts in Prakrit and Pali and Sanskrit in sometimes other languages, because some of these documents only appear in other languages, in Greek and Chinese and Thai and other places. So it requires being diligent in going back to the original source material. I would say 2 episodes that don't get. There's been a little bit now on sort of the grand strategy of the Mughal Empire, of the British Raj, but I'd say 2 episodes that don't get a lot. One is really sort of sort of early India, up to sort of pre-Chola in some ways, almost hasn't gotten a lot. There's a new book out on the Cholas, which and their sort of strategy. One other period I think that's fascinating is between roughly 1700 and 1857, where you had a number of quite powerful Indian kingdoms and empires that were jostling for power: the Sikhs, Marathas, Awadh, the Nizam in Hyderabad, the Ahom, so in Assam, Mysore. They were all jostling for power at this time. And then there were foreign actors as well, the British, the Portuguese, the French, and that's a very fascinating period that I have not seen really good studies of the international relations of that period.
While rediscovering India's ancient strategic route is important, there is also an interesting thread of continuity in modern times as well. A kind of diplomatic deja vu that reminds us how India's voice has often echoed across generation, even as the world around it has shifted dramatically. So in 1948, Pandit Nehru told the UN, the world is something bigger than the Europe. And in 2024, Mr. Jaishankar echoed that Europe has to grow out of the mindset that Europe's problem is world's problem. These sound remarkably similar, but they are spoken in 2 different worlds altogether. What does this continuity and divergence say about India's evolving identity on the world stage, according to you?
No, I mean, I think that there's nothing too deep in that. I mean, India obviously is not in Europe. It is, so I think that reflects that. And I think India quite regularly, I mean, 50 years from now, somebody will be saying the same thing. So I'm not sure there's too much needs to be read into that similarity. Look, I think I would put it this way. I think since independence, there have broadly been a few shared objectives over time. That is, again, Indian leaders have sought security and unity and security. They've sought progress and development for domestically with international assistance or international partnerships. They've sought a balance of power in the broader region, Asia, the Indo-Pacific. They've sought a peaceful, stable periphery, even though that's often been very difficult with some of the smaller neighbors. They've tried to manage this very tricky problem of Pakistan, which has become even more complicated since Pakistan's nuclearization. And they've tried to strive for India having a bigger place in global affairs. So I think that those objectives have been broadly consistent. What has changed are two things. What has changed, one is the international circumstances have changed. So the early Cold War and the era of decolonization of the 1940s and 50s, at a time when India, frankly, also was much more resource-starved. India was much poorer. It was dependent on food aid. It didn't have a nuclear umbrella, nuclear security ability. So those circumstances are very different from the 1970s and the 1990s and the 2024, 2025. So I think we need to. I've tried to categorize, the historical descriptions as what changed in the world and how it affected India. So that I think is one thing to keep in mind. So sometimes the same template doesn't work today, as it doesn't work when India is the fourth or fifth largest economy in the world. Its its partnerships are very different. The relationship between India and the US or India and China is very different from 1950. So the idea that you pursue the same strategy then and now, I think, is very short-sighted in many ways because international circumstances have changed, capabilities have changed. The second thing I think is that I think decision-making matters and worldviews matter. So one of the challenges is, when you go back and you see, India was not actually, this idea that India was sort of sitting out the Cold War or diffident is, I think, completely untrue. You look at India that was very active in the 1950s and early 60s, intervening in Congo and Korea, sending troops to the middle of Africa, mediating in the Korean War, taking a very activist role in bringing Japan back into the international community, engaging with the Western Europe. So again, you have a very activist India in that time. I think that in hindsight, there was a gap though between India's basic capabilities and its aspirations at that time, and that came to the fore with the 1962 India-China War, where India found it was underprepared for what was a more difficult world. So I think that that's the lesson to derive from that. But it led, I think, to a period, roughly, again, the 70s and 80s, and I describe it in much more detail in the book, where India was a little bit more on the back foot and had to play sort of defense, whether it was through a more sort of assertive defensiveness in its own neighborhood, and in some ways was a bit more checked out of international economic affairs and things like that. That has now changed again slowly since the 1990s with periods of acceleration. But we have periodic debates, right? So I think the last sort of major debate on this was really between, kind of roughly coincided with the UPA-2 government, 2009 to 14. It was after the global financial crisis. We had a new government in India. You also had Obama's election in the US, and he was also experimenting with outreach to China. He wanted to intervene more actively between India and Pakistan. And in that world, there was a very active debate in Delhi at that time and in India about how should India formulate its relations with the US and the West on the one hand and with China and Russia on the other. And I think it ultimately came out, we saw this in 2013, 14, 15, a little later, where you had a series of border crises with China. You had a much more a bigger reset with the US. And I think that sort of, in some ways, partly resolved that debate, although it keeps coming back. I think we're in another variation of that today. But it's not to say that, all I'm trying to remind people of is I think these circumstances matter. And the idea that you kind of, while there are echoes, even though, because those echoes exist because the broader interests there is that continuity. But we have to pay attention, I think, also to the importance of global circumstances, India's own capabilities, and leadership and decision-making at any given time.
Thank you so much for that clarity. But before we look too far out, it's worth turning our gaze closer to home as well and zoom in a bit to the immediate neighborhood, where India's balancing act is constantly tested. There is this image of Big Brother as well, where our partnerships look more like patronage. I think Abhinandan would take forth on that front, and yeah.
Yes, so having discussed all these, like broadly, India's foreign policy ever since we got independent and how it evolved, you gave a really detailed description, and I'm sure that your book also elaborates on that. I think, as Leshu said, it's prudent that we talk more about our neighborhood now, that we see post 2021, since the coup in Myanmar. It's been a very volatile kind of situation. So, sir, many of our neighbors, say Nepal or Maldives or even Bangladesh, we see that these they tend to, at this point of time, take up a pro-China posture. And this is despite India trying to, be the first responder in many crises. For example, whenever there's an earthquake in Nepal, like the devastating earthquake 10 years ago in 2015, we were the first responders. In Maldives, they had the water crisis or even their medical needs, their resource needs. India tries to play a major role and meet them, and we have the geographical proximity as compared to China and these nations. And the same goes for Bangladesh and other friends of ours. But still, these nations, they tend to take pro-China postures, like we saw in Maldives. Last year, there was a president who was elected, and he was elected on the slogan called India Out. Similarly, in Bangladesh, we see a government which has come up, the interim government. It tends to take pro-China postures. So, sir, do you think that we need to sort of relook into India's regional diplomacy in order to build a durable trust? And which domain do we need to specifically focus upon? Is it the economic domain, the economic scale, or cultural outreach, or simply we need some consistent political tension on these issues?
Yeah, so I have an entire chapter dedicated to the neighborhood in the book. And again, one of the things that sort of reinforced from my time in Delhi also was how important that is, because again, in many foreign capitals, they don't pay that much attention to Nepal, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Maldives. And it's much more important for India than it is for anybody else. I think a few things, though. I think a few premises. One is I would dispute the notion that any of these challenges are new. And I think part of I go into sort of a bit more detail. In the 1950s, we had coups in Nepal against the Ranas, in Myanmar. In Sri Lanka, there were some anti-Tamil riots and some legislation change. So again, we have some, these are problems, these are long-standing problems, sometimes domestically in these countries. Second, there's a few structural realities that need to be kept in mind. All of these countries are, in their own way, democratizing and opening up. Myanmar, let me set that aside, but at least Nepal, Bhutan, Sri Lanka, Maldives, Bangladesh. Even if it is in the public sphere, not always politically. But, you had an absolute monarchy in Nepal a little while ago. You had absolute monarchy in Bhutan. You had civil war in Sri Lanka and political assassinations there. You had essentially a autocracy in the Maldives. You had, again, strongman politics in the 80s in Bangladesh as well. So the fact is we have much more open political systems there, and competitive politics that mean that we will have regular changes in government in all of these places, to different degrees. Three, I think we have another actor, and I talk about the China factor in all of these countries going back many decades. But the fact is you have a China today that is able to provide certain things to these countries in a way that an external power wasn't able to in the past. So essentially their ability to invest in ports, for example, their ability to the number of tourists that come to Nepal or Maldives is much higher from China. So the economic clout particularly is rising in India's near abroad. So I think these are just some structural realities that India has to contend with, and the fact that there is a level of cross-border integration, political integration, which means that what happens in these countries will have spillover effects into India, right? So you have Madheshi populations who straddle the Nepal-India border. You have Tamils in India who have close kinship ties with Tamils in Sri Lanka. You have, Bangladesh again. You have that relationship. So the fact that India can be a passive actor in these developments, I think it also needs to be questioned. But by the way, there is a view in India that this is none of our business. We should stick out of it. So I think these are some structural factors to keep in mind. Again, I think if you take the longer view of history, I think it shows that some of these problems are not new. These have been longstanding, and certainly many of them. I remember, there were very bad relations with India and Nepal in 2016, 2015, 2016. It was so we've had in the 80s we had a period. India intervened militarily in Sri Lanka, intervened to stop a coup in the Maldives. Essentially blockaded Nepal in the late 80s, early 90s as well because of a number of tensions that arose. And we've had some very bad relations with Bangladesh in the 70s and 80s as well. So again, these are not entirely new problems. Now, what has changed is a big thing. I think one thing, and a lot of this comes from Prime Minister Modi himself, his first act since becoming Prime Minister was to invite his the leaders of these countries to his it wasn't a SARC mission. It was his oath taking in 2014. He invited the leaders of all of these countries there. Yeah, during his inauguration. Yes, and this I think it shows a very early commitment to integrating this neighborhood. And a couple of things happened. I think one is he realized early on, it was actually the SARC summit in Nepal in 2015, as I recall, that essentially Pakistan was blocking a lot of SARC initiatives. So SARC was a problem. It was actually limiting, that institution was actually limiting India's ability to do a lot with its neighborhood, which is why we've seen subsequently India invest a lot in alternatives like BIMSTEC, doing a lot of bilateral and trilateral initiatives, including, say, with Nepal and Bangladesh on cross-border vehicle flows, with Sri Lanka and Maldives on maritime security. So you've seen now India looking beyond SARC in some ways. The other thing is just a very big focus on regional diplomacy, bilateral particularly, and in terms of aid and assistance, and that is facilitating trade. So today now India and Bangladesh, in some ways, why things are so tense right now is because the trade relationship between India and Bangladesh has actually taken off over the past few years. So it is having, in some ways, a bigger. The political irritants are actually of greater consequence today. But this is a big departure from the past because prior to Prime Minister Modi's trip in late 2014 to Nepal, I think no Indian Prime Minister had visited since Vajpayee. So I think it's been 11 years almost since Indian had visited Nepal, Kathmandu. And even that was for a multilateral summit. So last bilateral visit was even longer, right? So there was actually a sort of a degree of neglect in the neighborhood, which I think is now being made up for. This is not to say the problems are going to go away. Certainly not in the short term. I talk about we should expect, because of the conditions I mentioned at the beginning, we should expect more volatility political volatility in India's relations with neighbors. We'll have changes in government. At the same time, that creating that codependence is important. So we've seen that in the volumes of aid and lending. You have a JVP government in Sri Lanka, which in the past, if you told people this 30 years ago, they would have been sort of very shocked. This was a sort of insurgent movement in Sri Lanka, which India was very skeptical of. And yet you had quite a successful visit recently by the new leader of Sri Lanka to India. You had a number of major defense agreements signed, which again is quite notable. And the fact is India has become Sri Lanka's largest lender as well because of the financial crisis that they went into. So again, all this is the way of saying, I think sometimes the way these relationships are caricatured, particularly sometimes in these capitals, because in Dhaka, Kathmandu, Colombo, I've been to all those places. There is that grouse that they hear that India is acting in this way, and I think sometimes just explaining, look, India has certain sensitivities that need to be kept in mind, and that's just good neighborliness. And then sometimes understanding also that for political reasons, at any given time, the government of the day often in these countries is accused of being too pro-India.
Yeah.
And the opposition is criticizes, and then the roles reverse when there's a change in government. So I think we should just, it's incumbent, I think, upon analysts in India to understand what is political posturing, what is the reality. Understanding this context, being sensitive to some of their concerns. I think there are many issues where they say Bangladesh did some military agreements with Sri Lanka a few years back, and they said, well, we would prefer to do it with India, but India didn't have something to offer. So I think I think that's good feedback for Indians to hear, so that when the next time that happens, India can offer something, whether it's an investment, whether it's technical support. We also have, by the way, again, I don't want to go into too much detail here, but we've had the reverse problem as well, where in Nepal, for example, India has actually offered things in terms of infrastructure spending that Nepal has blocked purely for political reasons, which hurts Nepal. It hurts, so that excuse that India isn't offering enough, in some cases, is not always as sometimes is more politically motivated than you would imagine.
Indeed, sir. So I believe then these are some old issues which is causing this kind of volatility. And
yeah, but I think some things are changing as well, right? So again, we have an acceleration in their domestic politics as well. So the domestic politics of Kathmandu today looks very different from 20 years ago, and India has to deal with these new realities.
Yeah, even Sri Lanka, it's quite different, as you pointed out, politically. But some issues they remain the same. But definitely, it's true, sir, that post 2014 we have had the neighborhood first policy, and from we've shifted from look east to act east. So definitely, I think
That's more of a rhetorical shift, and I go into a bit more detail as to what is actually, again, to be honest, I don't put a lot of stock into the slogans. Again, leaders have to brand certain things, neighborhood first, act east, look east. But what I try and go into is less the rhetoric and more in terms of what is led to in terms of actual policy changes. So, for example, the look east to act east shift, I think two big shifts that occurred related to that. One is taking a broader view instead of just Southeast and Northeast Asia to looking at a broader integrated Indo-Pacific. That was one of the changes that signaled. The second was actually adding a much stronger security component to it. And today, if you see, for example, India providing a submarine to Myanmar, providing anti-ship missiles to Philippines, helping Indonesia with maritime domain awareness, doing naval exercises with Vietnam, that's all reflective of that change. So all I'm saying is the beyond the point, the words are political, but what are the policy changes that have occurred?
Yes, that's very true. And sir, when we are talking about this neighborhood, so we mentioned China and we discussed about how these nations are taking pro-China postures. So I want to shift our discussion more specifically towards the Indo-China relations, because in your book Vishwa Shastra, you also mentioned that India must manage its competition with China. And recently, I was watching an interview of yours on the YouTube channel Nallan Talk with Mr. Saurabh Dwivedi, senior journalist. And you, in that interview, when he questioned you about this, you mentioned that it is very difficult to sort of get, for the Indian side to get their points across to the Chinese side and to sort of even get them to acknowledge our basic concerns. So, sir, why do you think this kind of situation is being faced? What are some of the biggest communication or perception challenges between our two nations today, and how to bridge them?
There's a sort of short term. I mean, I think it's a big short term problem because it's at the political level in China. In some ways, I think people forget that the Chinese government is not structured like most other governments. It's a single party state. You have you have in some ways three parallel governance structures in China. You have the state apparatus, you have the party apparatus, Communist Party of China, and you have the military, the PLA. And Xi Jinping happens to be the head of. He has three titles. He's the head of all three. He's the party general secretary. He's the president of the state apparatus, and he's the chair of the Central Military Commission. So he has three jobs, but he is the center. He's the where they meet. So it functions very differently from engagement with the US or UK or Russia, or even Russia, where you have a single state apparatus. You talk to the foreign minister, you talk to the defense minister. It works in a certain way. So I'll give you this is a very specific example. We had this very strange thing happen where the Indian defense minister Rajnath Singh ji, he goes to China for the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting, SCO. The SCO was set up to be a counterterrorism organization. That was the original mandate of the SCO. India and Pakistan are now members. Now, a statement, even a very mild statement that doesn't mention Pakistan by name, could not be passed that condemned acts of terrorism against India. So, with he did the right thing from India's point of view, which is not sign that statement. And how could he? And the fact that China, as the host, could not even do something as small as that for India at this time, I think it reflects that challenge that I mentioned. That I mentioned to in that interview, which is it's very hard to communicate one. Sometimes it's a communication problem. Sometimes it's a very deliberate strategy on the part of China, which is they don't, if you look at the depth of the China-Pakistan relationship today, by some accounts, almost 2/3 of China's defense exports still go to Pakistan only. You look at their support for Pakistan at the UN Security Council. So some of it is deliberate. I'm not saying this is just a communication factor, but it is hard. It is doubly hard to get across. And part of it just has to do with the nature of the Chinese government and how it is established. So, I have interactions with counterparts from almost every major country I meet, in group settings sometimes. So I do interact occasionally with Chinese think tanks. But the fact is, you wonder, even if you get across, and by the way, they are often very difficult to. They come with their talking points, but they often don't want to listen. So even it's hard to get through even at that stage. But even when you do, if you can get through there, it's unclear whether that feedback is going up to anybody of consequence who has some control over decision making. And that I think is a big challenge. So again, we've now seen, thanks to the Kailash Mansarovar Yatra, we're seeing now an exchange of journalists after a long time. This is good. And India and China are two big, large, countries that need to understand each other better at a social level at the very least. But when you translate that into kind of political engagement, there are meetings at the top level. I mean, I'm not saying, the diplomats meet and such, but it's very hard. I mean, I sometimes wonder what the real point of any kind of track 2 dialogue is, if you're not dealing with a counterpart that is not acting in good faith.
Indeed, sir. So I think it boils down to the political structure that is there, because the consequential people are not the ones whom we are interacting with, unfortunately. So that's.
And you have cases where sometimes it appears, at least, that the foreign ministry in China agrees, but the PLA doesn't agree, and therefore it doesn't get done. Yes, where you don't have divide, that same degree of divide in not many other places.
Yes, sir. So I think that's a challenge that we have to see, but I believe that maybe this may worsen forward, because as we see, Mr. Xi Jinping, who is the president, he also, I think, recently removed the term limits. There were term limits for the Chinese president. He got rid of them, and he purged his opposition on corruption charges. So it's a tough maze to.
Yeah. The term limits were somewhat artificial. I mean, look, we've only had four major leadership transitions in China since the Communist Revolution. And 2 of them were quite messy. So you've only really had the last 2 that were even somewhat smooth transitions at all. So this is going to be a challenge.
Yes, sir, indeed. And now I believe that we've spoken about our neighborhood and about the second Asian major nation, China. So I think we should also sort of talk about the multipolar movement and the global south. We should move ahead because our neighbors are part of the global south, but we also try to, India is right now positioning itself as a leader of the global south, and we started the Global South Summit as well in 2021 on an annual basis. So Vaishu, I think you can sort of steer this discussion towards that direction, towards the multipolar movement and towards the Global South and India's sort of position there.
Sure. So I begin again with Vishwa Shastra, where you talked about the power shift from Atlantic to Indo-Pacific. So what are the most significant implications, according to you, in the foreign policy domain that you see in the next domain when we are talking about India? How does it tie into the vision of Viksit Bharat by 2047?
Well, that's a That's a big one. I'm not sure I can do justice to that last question, but okay. But on the question of the global south, um, I think there are a lot of misperceptions about that too, both in India and outside of India. The By the way, I tend not to use the term multipolarity, unipolarity much in my book, because I think it's confusing again, and it also blurs the line between what realities are at any given time and what the aspirations are. And India obviously strives for a multipolar world because it wants its own voice and an interest to be defended on the international stage, and that can only be achievable in a multilateral world. But there is clearly a sort of diffusion of power taking place. And to put it, I think, in more tangible terms, the US is about 20 to 25% of the global economy, which it was, by the way, in 1992 as well. So, it's remained pretty consistent. The problem, I think, for the US is it had a network of close allies, and including economic partners, the G7. The rest of the G7 saw their share of the global economy drop from more than 40% to less than 20% today. So that's where it's really Europe, Japan, where you've seen that relative decline take place. China, meanwhile, has gone from 2% of the global economy to almost 20% of the global economy, and 19%, I think, or something. So that is really the big rebalance. And then the rest of the world, including India, have seen their share increase. India has gone from roughly 1% to 4% of the global economy in that period. So that is really, I find that's a better way of describing the world as it is today. And so we're at least at this point of time, a place where the US and China are the two largest global economies. India will soon be number 3, but at least for the near future, a distant number 3. And this is the world that India will have to navigate. Now, the global south, I think, is also a little bit of a confusing term. Actually, most of the opposition I get to it is from the global north. People are very skeptical. Well, what do all these countries have in common? The fact is, there are some things in common. And broadly, it's 3 baskets of issues. One, institutional reform. These were countries that were marginalized when a lot of multilateral organizations were created first in the in after World War II, and then again in the 1990s. They didn't have so one of the things they are consistently advocating for is reform of international institutions to ensure that their voice is heard more effectively. Second is their health, food, and energy security concerns. And this came to the fore during the COVID pandemic, when often these were the countries that were the last to receive vaccines and even protective equipment. Their energy security needs were not often taken into account, and their food security needs. And those 2 issues came up after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, when global food and energy prices spiked as a result of that. And then the third set of issues is really climate justice. Which is, there's a feeling that the global north has not been sufficiently, paid heed, whether it's to adaptation, whether it's to financing, whether it's to transfers of technology. And so those are really the 3 sets of issues where India says these are things that India wants. India wants all of those things. It's in the Indian national interests. It also happens to be somewhat in the national interest of 100 other countries. And so to the extent that you can create a coalition that advocates for these things collectively, that is better. So that really is what the global south is about at this point of time. And again, from a policy standpoint, the question is how to make that effective. So it's there is again that Voice of the Global South summit that India has been hosting, but the real nuts and bolts will actually be in terms of other concrete deliverables in some of the areas I mentioned. UN Security Council reform, for example, World Bank, IMF reform. New kinds of climate, international solar alliance, which India is taking a leadership role in, for example. So those, I think, are some of the ways in which this is realistically playing out. There's a lot of resistance from a few factors. One is there's not always exact consensus on broad issues. There is, but when you get into detail, India and Brazil and Indonesia have very different priorities when it comes to, say, climate issues. So how do you put that together? 2, Russia and China particularly want to steer the global south in a very different direction, in a more anti-Western direction, which India, Brazil, Indonesia, others are a bit more reluctant to do. And the other thing is there's resistance from the global north, which is some of these changes will come at their expense, or they believe it will come at their expense. So it's not going to be easy to do this, but this is broadly, I think, where we're headed with the global south. On the last issue you mentioned, which is how do we, I mean, look, this is ultimately what it's about, right? I mean, foreign policy is not simply sort of, Nehru used this phrase, sort of it's not empty games on a chessboard. And that's correct. It's it's not a game of a board game. This is these matter to, I try and give a lot of concrete examples as to how foreign policy, public health, improvements in public health, the development of metro rail, it was really a foreign policy exercise in many ways. So these matter to the day-to-day lives, food security, energy security. They matter to day-to-day lives of 1.4 billion Indians. So how do we bring it back to sort of Viksit Bharat? I mean, I articulate a few ways. I don't go into a lot of detail because I don't want to be sucked into domestic policy very much. But broadly, two things. One, I think you need security. This idea that you could have prosperity without security is a very short-sighted one. And we've seen that just given the not just India's own experience with China and Pakistan recently, but also other countries' experiences, Israel, Europe's experiences, right? If you don't have security, you cannot have that prosperity. So really thinking through how to militarily prepare India for a variety of contingencies is important. And I think something that unfortunately is often overlooked by people in the development world, for example, interactive development world. A second thing is, I think in this day and age, and I go into a bit of the global economy and shifts in the global economy, we're in the age of competing industrial policies, whereby the US, China, Europe are all supporting their own national industry for a variety of reasons: economic security, national security, job creation at home, which is becoming a political issue in most countries, and global competitiveness. And so for all these reasons, India needs to invest in an industrial policy that has at least some manufacturing component to it. And obviously, since India cannot do everything, focusing on certain key critical aspects of the value chains is important. So I think we started to see the outlines of a real industrial policy over the past few years, particularly since the pandemic, last 5 years. But there's a lot more that needs to be done. And I go into a bit more detail as to what is required.
So my next question is focused on Latin America, and it is with regards to the historical roads that we have taken. With Prime Minister Modi's July 2025 visit to Argentina, Chile, and other places, yet there remains a glaring absence of sustained focus on Latin America in India's broader foreign policy. So given the region's growing importance in critical mineral trade, trade diversification, and multilateral platform, is this limited engagement a strategic blind spot that undermines our position? And what have been the challenges so far that we are not able to actually chart this potential?
One of the advantages of being in ORF America is we're doing a lot more in Latin America out of here. That's part of, the part of the reason we call it ORF America as opposed to ORF US is that we wanted to have that ability. So I'm going to Mexico again this month. I've gone to Brazil a few times last year. We're doing a lot more in Latin America. It's interesting. Look, one of the sort of critiques I got from a few people of my book is like, oh, you don't have chapters on certain regions and geographies. You don't have a Europe chapter and a Russia chapter and a Latin America chapter, and that's on purpose. That's very deliberate, because again, I don't want it to be like we need to have good relations with Latin America for the sake of good relations. The point what I was trying to do is, what are India's objectives, right? And I lay those out. And then how do different regions and actors help with those objectives? So with Latin America, I think you have to keep in mind a few things. One is just geography. It's far away. Two, there's limited cultural contact because it was largely Spanish speaking, with the exception of the Guyana, Trinidad, and the Caribbean, some of the Caribbean countries. You didn't have that sort of historical linkages with Latin America. So there are reasons for it. It's not a blind spot. It's that you have, if you're if you're the Ministry of External Affairs or if you're an Indian corporation, you have limited resources, and you have to decide how much of those resources. If you can't have both a neighborhood first strategy and a Latin America first strategy, that doesn't make sense, right? You have to prioritize. So unfortunately, for these reasons I mentioned, Latin America tends to be at the lowest end of that priority because of, again, the tyranny of geography, the sort of relative size, the lack of historical linkages. Now, for some of the reasons you mentioned, there's now a bit of a rediscovery of it. For example, India has opened up a few new embassies in Paraguay, being one place where there's a new embassy that was opened 2 years back. In the Caribbean Dominican Republic, there's a new embassy that's been opened. So there's been sometimes Indian industry has gone ahead. So there are now Indian investments. Tatas have a presence in Chile, in Uruguay. They have teams in those places that they're actually doing quite well. You have I was in the Amazon, and there's a Bajaj auto assembly plant, for two-wheelers in the Amazon in Brazil, and they've become quite popular in Colombia. Sometimes that's happening not because of the Indian government, it's because Indian businesses are finding opportunities in these places. Oil is a big concern. India was a big oil importer from Venezuela, now from Guyana. So has a stake in their critical minerals is emerging. There's some interest in greater investments in Argentina and Paraguay and Chile in certain critical minerals. So the stuff is happening, but again, the base is very low, and it would probably remain a relatively low priority for India. But I think now you're starting to see some of that. Actually, the Prime Minister is he's in Trinidad tomorrow, and then on to Brazil after that for the BRICS meeting. So he's doing another trip to South America. So that engagement continues. But I do think one of the things that I hope people take away from the book is, on paper, it would be nice to be able to do 100 things, but any government, no matter, even the US government has to prioritize, right? And the Chinese government has what matters to them most. And unfortunately, for some of these reasons, Latin America will remain a low priority. But again, we're finding now avenues of engagement. There's been a very good meeting recently between the Mexican president and Prime Minister as well. So there's a lot more that can be done, but it will require that level of understanding and investment, and not just on India's part, by the way. It requires that from the partner as well. They need to pay. I'll give you a very specific example on that. I was in Mexico about a year and a half ago. Very good meetings, a lot of interest in India, a lot of investment both ways that I learned about. I didn't realize one of the largest bread manufacturers in India is actually a Mexican-owned company. I didn't think so. You learn. That being said, there are almost no Indian students in Mexico. And the Mexican government, at least then, made it very difficult for Indians to get visas to come to Mexico. So you had, for example, trade fairs where the Indian stalls were empty for no other reason, not because there wasn't interest from India, but because the Mexican government made it difficult for those Indian business people to get visas to come in, because they have reasons for it. They're concerned about migration to the US and such, and getting pressure from the US. But all I'm saying is, sometimes it's not just on India's part. It requires investment on the part of the partners as well, in trying to understand Indian sensitivities or Indian concerns about things. So for a while, again, the Mexican diplomatic corps in India was not issuing visas very, very much. So that has been a lingering problem.
Next on zooming on slightly newer frontier, we'll be discussing about tech and cyberspace. So India finds itself in a pivotal position here, because in recent months, we have seen that leading voices at Google have recognized India as a proactive force in cybersecurity. And Financial Times has also spotlighted India's canonical role as third way in global tech, where it can balance American innovation, China's control, and EU's right-based model. So I think Abhinandan would be taking this conversation from here on. But yeah.
So Veshu will set the ground pretty much. So sir, I just want to ask that, as technology these days, it has become a battlefield of influence. So how do you think India should sort of secure its digital borders and at the same time build global alliances in technology?
Yeah, that's it's a tricky question because there are multiple layers to it. Let me see how to take this. I mean, look, the plus side, I think, is we are in a world which is increasingly digitized, right? Every whether it's social welfare, whether it's military applications, almost everything is going to be is to some degree digitized today. And that means that there's a huge demand for lots of things, the hardware, of course, but also the software. And both require a great deal of engineering and engineering talent. And today, the fact is there are few countries that are producing engineers at scale as India is. I mean, China is as well, but the Indian labor is much more mobile. And so that has put India in this very interesting situation where the world is actually quite dependent, and perhaps much more than people realize, on Indian talent. Without Indian talent, a lot of things will not work, essentially. The question, though, is it's running up against other issues, which is, for example, anti-immigration sentiment. So the easiest thing to do in many cases would be to import that talent from India to other places. But because of growing political pressures in many countries, that's not happening. So now we're starting to see many places looking to invest in India to create data centers there that can actually help service a global marketplace. So that's, I think, where the balance of employment, talent flows, immigration policy, and economic policy are all kind of coming together on that set of issues.
Capacity centers. Global GCC.
Yeah. So you're starting to find some sort of creative solutions, but today there's almost no major big company I can think of that doesn't have some exposure to India, either in terms of sourcing talent or as a market, or both in some cases. So this is all very, I think, quite critical. So for all these reasons, people are looking at India as to what are the standards being set there, because it will have ripple effects elsewhere. I think that there's a plus and minus side to the application side. On the one hand, many people are saying, well, India is not innovating as much as it should be, given all of this. And in some degree, it's true. We don't have as much R&D investments in India because that funding has to come from somewhere. That either has to come from the private sector or from the public sector. There's been some influx now from the public sector in AI, quantum, some basic research to certain key universities that they're trying to make nodes of excellence. But it's still, on global standards, not sufficient to, there's still a long way to go to catch up to others. So this large state-backed investments into R&D has not yet happened in India, not at scale. The private sector hasn't filled that gap there. They have in other areas, but not there. The other thing that's happened on the positive side of the ledger is India has decided to make a lot of these things public. So make it a public good, digital, DPI in some ways, digital public infrastructure. And that has actually meant, enabled, I think, on the application side, some very innovative and interesting applications, which other countries, particularly in the global south, are looking at. And actually, we're involved in a number of projects in West Africa, Latin America, a few other places where they're actively looking, how can we facilitate learnings from India and some of these other places, obviously tailored for their own unique circumstances. So that has opened up a lot of room. The challenge, I think, is for many large-scale international investors, they haven't really appreciated what opportunities that opens up. It's not, the business case is harder to make for DPI, and that means that there hasn't been sufficient interest for. Lastly, on this, where are we going forward? I think we will see a state where India has to balance national security. The fact is, data is going to be value. And India produces over 20% of the world's data already. It has only 3% of world's data centers. And so there's already a gap between the physical infrastructure needed and the opportunity that's there in terms of the data that India is producing. And the question, I think, is how to narrow that gap going forward. So I think we will see an investment in data centers in India. The question is what kind of data centers? Should it be cutting edge? That it'll run into challenges such as energy, water, land acquisition, but I think there'll be some movement there going forward. The other thing is on the policy and governance side, which is where will India go with that? And I suspect there will be. This is something that big companies have resisted, but India will have to go to some kind of data localization as the default setting, purely for national security reasons, but also for the exploitation of that data. And then enter into a series of bilateral agreements which will allow for reciprocal access or reciprocal arrangements. So for data, for more open data flows. So I think that's the way. Some kind of formulation around those lines will be the way forward to thread the needle between how do you ensure that India's data is secure, that it is not exploited commercially by too much by others that we don't want it to be exploited by, but also ensure a free flow of data with certain trusted partners. And so I think that will be broadly speaking, the path forward. So I expect we'll see sort of data arrangements. One very interesting thing that happened is the data provisions in the India-UK trade agreement that was recently finalized, which are much more broad than many other countries India's had with many other countries, including the UAE and Singapore. So that I think will be the new template going forward with the negotiations with the US, with the EU, with others as well. So
Neat, sir. So you actually simplified everything and you gave a very broad kind of view. In the beginning, you said that it's a tricky question, but you certainly does justice to it, and I believe our viewers would get a better understanding about this crucial issue. And so, when we are talking about data and technology, what another thought that comes to my mind is that I believe post 2016, 2017, when there was a great influx of cheap mobile phone and cheap hardware from China within India. And there was also a geo reliance that had been launched, which sort of reduced the data rates down to almost zero. So that basically sort of had an effect of in sort of increasing the penetration of mobile phones and of data use of internet and the use of social media as well within the common general public in India. And like now, even if you go on the road, if you go to a stall, a Momo stall or anywhere, you'll find that a person will have a smartphone and will have social media and YouTube. Yes, sir. So basically, now because of this, I believe that there's an increased awareness about foreign policy and diplomacy amongst the youth and the ordinary citizens. I mean, you go to Instagram, you'll see most of the reels. They're about something about China, India, and Europe, etc. So, do you see this as a sort of a strategic opportunity for India? And how can this new wave of increased awareness amongst the public about foreign policy, which was initially seen as an elitist thing, sort of help shape a smarter and more inclusive grand strategy for India?
I mean, in some ways, it's very good, right? It should not be an elite matter. And again, I try and show a little bit in the book as well how it matters to an average person, right? So today, the price of your dal is because of certain trade negotiations that happened with with Myanmar and with Canada and other places that supply dal to India, right? So it's something as basic as that. But again, you go across, again, healthcare, your price of petrol, your infrastructure, your airports and metros, all of that has an international component to it. I think the other thing is, Indian youth are more globalized than they've been, right? There were a lot more students abroad. We have some 6 lakh students abroad at any given time, which is amazing, so even for a country of India's size, that's quite a large number. So, and you have more people who worked abroad. I'll give you an example. I mean, I went to a pretty good school in Delhi in the 90s, in the mid-90s. And I was the only person in my class of 45 who had ever traveled abroad. And I bet I haven't done this, but if I go back to that same school today, at least half would have gone on holiday abroad or something like that, right? So it tells you, I think the world has changed in some very radical ways, mostly for the better. So in some ways, it's very exciting to see this level of interest. What I worry about, though, is the information sources that people are getting. And you saw this even during Operation Sindoor and stuff, which is people had such skewed expectations of what is realistic. Pakistan is a nuclear weapon state, right? So it's while India does need to retaliate and should have the right to retaliate against terrorism, there are considerations to keep in mind. There's some of what I see about the US or Russia or China or Europe, and a lot of it is posturing by these people who have, in some cases, they do know better and should not be saying stuff that is irresponsible. but that's what gets views. So you say, the more inflammatory things you say, the more it gets viewed on social media and TikTok, or in India, TikTok's banned, but like, Instagram Reels and such. So unfortunately, I feel like, in my conversations with you, I'll have a lot of things, and there's a great deal of interest, which is good. But sometimes I find it's the starting premise for a lot of their views. It's because it's informed by some X4G guy on Instagram Reels who is sort of pushing some particular agenda, or sometimes saying things because it's popular. It doesn't actually inform them in any really meaningful way. And in part, again, I wrote this book. It's just my modest contribution to this, to provide that. It's supposed to be a basic thing, so that at least start the conversation there. You can then critique it. I mean, I hope it generates more discussion as well. But what I try to lay out as clearly as possible is, look, this is the reality of what things. I've tried to support, everything I write, I have sort of supporting information for it and such. But I again, I'd say short answer really is that great that there's so much enthusiasm. It needs to be democratized. But I worry that of a lack of sort of good, accurate information and sources. And even, but it is not just a social media thing. I mean, I worry also, I see university curricula which start off with, this sort of very idealistic, the world is a family, Vasudev sort of stuff, which again is, in an ideal world, is wonderful. But the world is not ideal.
Indeed, sir. And I think then that's a double-edged sword. On one hand, you have misinformation and agendas that can be driven, and the other hand, enthusiasm is a good thing. And you talked about your book that you're trying to simplify.
Well, but one thing I do worry about is, and I've seen this, is external actors exploiting that as well. That it's very easy to exploit that information environment. I've seen people who I'm quite surprised about spreading Pakistani and Chinese disinformation, which and the fact these are people with significant followings. So it's very, I think, quite worrisome that this has actually opened up space for the exploitation of some of these sentiments.
Indeed, sir. That's a major concern. But I think that then your book will play a major role in sort of channelizing that enthusiasm that the youth have, and go right direction. Yes, sir. So, talking about your book, I think, Vaishu, you can steer the direction towards of our conversation towards Sir's book, and sort of, ask him about the title and about some things about it, so that our audience also get a view about the book.
Yes, so Vishwa Shastra is such a rich title, deceptively simple yet quietly profound. Vishwa, the world, not just as geography, but as lived complexity, and Shastra, not merely a treatise or manual, but a body of knowledge, often sacred, often strategic. So together, the phrase feels like an invocation, not a manifesto of dominance, but a mediation on how one positions oneself in relation to the world. And why did you feel this was the right moment to write this book? What was your personal idea when you came up with this title? And if you were to write a postscript to it today, is there anything you would add? Something new happening in the world that you think would shape India's strategic choices in the near future?
Great question, and you actually described the title more eloquently than I would have done so. So thank you for that. No, a few things. One, actually, the book started earlier. I started writing a variation of this in 2016, 2017. So it's been almost 8 years in the works in some way, not consistently. And I did a first draft in late 2018. And then didn't publish it then. And then because of other events, including the COVID pandemic and other things, I actually had to rewrite it. I made it much more descriptive in the end. And the first version was much more argumentative. But I then went back and said, no, I need to create a foundational chronological text. So the book was written, I finished it in May of 2024. Actually, the day of the election results I sent off my draft to the publisher, and then the summer we sort of edited it, and it came out in December. But the title came later. So my working title for it, actually the working title of the original book I had was called Realignments. And it was slightly a bit of a play on non-alignment, but it's basically how India has sort of realigned at different times. That was a broad thesis. But then the working title I had, because it was more descriptive at the end, was sort of India, an introduction to India and the world. And the publisher said that sounds like a really boring title. No one's going to buy the book. So I needed to come up with something a bit more catchy. And it was two different things. I think a lot of readers would be familiar with Vishwa because of Vishwa Guru, Vishwa Bandhu. That those phrases have been popularized, particularly by the Prime Minister, meaning the world. And then the Artha Shastra, like I wanted it to be sort of give it that kind of timelessness and that was connoted by sort of an old epic. The one bit I'm cheating a little bit is the Shastra was traditionally like a treatise, as you said. And that means it's sort of more theoretical. And I very deliberately did not make this theoretical. It's very practical, like this is what happened when, this is what is happening. So it's a bit of a cheat in that way on my end, but I thought this was a catchy enough title that it would invoke a particular Indian tradition and point of view. Finally, what would be the things I would change? So I finished writing it in May 2024. There've been a number of major events since then. So it does cover things like the G20 summit, the Gaza war is mentioned. So some events quite relatively recent. A lot on India, China, a lot on the consequences of Russia and Ukraine. What hasn't been covered are a few things. I think Donald Trump's election, the Bangladesh change in government that happened, and then of say Operation Sindoor. I think there are a few other things, but those would be, I'd say, three things that stand out as major developments since then. I don't think the historical narrative wouldn't change. I would obviously add things to these development chronologically. I also don't think the broader lessons would change because, for example, I described the sort of tensions happening in Bangladesh, that you have these different forces and different it's sort of in some ways a clash of identities within Bangladesh that has played out over the past 20, 30 years. So in some ways, we've just seen the latest episode in that. And I discussed sort of the complexities of India's engagement with Bangladesh there. The same with the US. I mean, the broader trends, I think, are correct, which is it talks about a US that is more keen on burden sharing, that it's resetting the trade, less committed to its old alliance structure. So in some ways, the trends that we're seeing under Trump have accelerated, certainly. I would say I predicted that exactly, but the broader direction, I think, is still broadly on point. And then Operation Sindoor also, I think, I talk about every India-Pakistan crisis going back to the 90s, if not earlier, back to 47 in some ways. And the need for India to have military preparedness, how to deal with terrorism, how to deal with Pakistan's nuclear status and such. So again, I don't think if anything, I think the book would help provide some background for these incidents that the three in particular that I mentioned. But I don't think they would require a heavy rewriting of them. But when the strategy section where I say this is what India needs to do, I don't think that has changed in a significant way yet. Again, maybe 5 years from now it might, or 10 years from now.
Yes, sir. So when it changes, then we can expect a sequel to that.
I'll have to do an updated edition or something like that. But I wrote it. This was the first time I was writing a book like this, and so it was. When I was writing it, I had to take out some stuff because I wanted it to be something that someone should pick up 5 years from now, and say, okay, it's broadly correct. And certainly the historical section, should not. There are a few things I realized I probably could have included, but they're minor. They're relatively minor things.
Yes, sir. And now we've taken this discussion through various dimensions and some very serious, some very personal. So now, sir, before we let you go, I would like to sort of bring this conversation to a sort of a lighter note. So your father, the Honorable External Affairs Minister, S. Jaishankar ji, he famously compared once foreign policy to cricket. So to test that, I would like to ask you, sir, that if India's current grand strategy, if it were a cricket format, what kind of cricket format would it be? Would it be like a T20 sprint or a tactical one-day international, or maybe a patient 5-day test match, and why?
The easy answer is all three. And this actually is very, it's a good question. In some ways, you have to prepare to play all three formats at the same time. It would be like a bilateral series, where now we do 4 tests followed by 5 1 days and then two T20s at the end, right? You actually have to prepare for all of those things and use the skills. You'll use a Surya Kumar Yadav for the T20s in a way you won't use him for the test, right? You'd have to change your fielding formations for the long term, for the short term, and the medium term. So I think it's a good, and cricket is actually an excellent analogy for foreign policy because it is so complex, it's so specialized. You have to use so many different tools. The conditions change. You have a good fast bowling wicket, you can exploit that. If your batters are weak in certain areas, you have to minimize exposure. So I think it's a very good format. But the short answer is I think you have to do all three at the same time. It's like playing all three formats simultaneously, which is difficult. So even now you're looking at what are the problems of today and the next few months. There are problems there. You have to also keep in account what are the longer term vision. So having a Viksit Bharat vision, whether or not it is met 100% is important, because I think you have to strive for something. And then again, having the medium term game, because to be honest, there's a lot of effort that goes into projections in international relations. To be honest, any projection over 10 years is suspect, including economic predictions, and 20 years is definitely, I don't think it's worth doing that exercise beyond 20 years. And if you look past, every time people have made in 1945, what is the world going to look like in 65? In 1965, what's it going to look like in 85? In 85, what's it going to look like in 2005? All those predictions were wrong, right? Because there are these uncertainties that come in. So I think looking out 20 years is a very reasonable projection. That's the outer limit. But beyond a point, I see these things like, what will the global economy look like in 2080 or, the end of the century? And honestly, those are really based on very questionable assumptions and long trend lines that don't hold out, because the world is actually much more disruptive than it plays out. So again, when we talk about bringing it back to the question of multipolarity, there are certain things I think we can plan for the next 5 to 7 to 10 years reasonably well. But beyond that, I think it's very difficult. So again, bringing it back to cricket, we have to play all three formats.
Yes, so I think volatility and uncertainty is sort of a norm in foreign policy and at the global stage. And I think that this is even ever more relevant now, because even daily we see with the Honorable President Trump in America, we see the policies keep changing, such volatility with tariffs, with other things. So.
And you have to deal, again, Trump is particularly difficult because there are a lot of things that really get stuck at his level. It's his personal decision that will change. And we're dealing with some of that actually even this week and next week, in fact. But I think you have to have engagement at different levels with him. Actually, a colleague of mine and I wrote something about the debates in the Trump administration on foreign policy. And there are in some ways 3 very different debates happening, not tied to each other. One is a strategic set of debates. One is an economic set of debates on the international economy. And then some have to do with him personally. And sometimes, you can get 2 of them right, but the third one is off, right? And so it's becoming very difficult. And by the way, one consolation I should mention, a lot of questions I get, people are like, this is a problem for India. And I think sometimes I feel I have to remind people that these are not India-specific problems, right? It's not just in, some of the challenges we're facing with the US, for example, today are not. India is not even facing the worst of it, right? Others are, including some close US friends and allies. Same, you asked about China earlier, right? What is of difficulties with engaging China? Those are not unique to India. Other countries are facing those same challenges as well. So I think it helps sometimes to step out and look at, again, how does it look from others' perspective? Well, sometimes you come to the realization that in India's case, it's not as bad as we sometimes make it out to be.
Yes, sir. So, sir, we've almost discussed everything I believe that we had set out to. So before we conclude our podcast, we would sort of, like to do a rapid fire session with you. something, which is, it's a Gen Z thing. So I believe you know what is a rapid fire. Like you have to quickly, we'll ask you questions and you just have to, whatever comes to your mind, you just have to sort of shoot it. So Vaishu, would you like to start this? Like alternatively, we can do this and you can go ahead with the first. You can just unmute yourself.
You're on mute.
Yeah, my first question would be your favorite book. Is it Vishwa Shastra or is it India Way?
That's not a good objection. I'll say selfishly Vishwa Shastra. They're very different books, but Vishwa Shastra.
Okay.
Okay, the second question, if you had to choose a friend who's going to always be on India's side, would it, and you have to just choose between them. So would it be Russia or would it be America?
If they will always be on India's side, then obviously the US. I think the US brings more to the table. It's a more multifaceted, it's more capable, all that. I think the question is if that will happen. But I think if you had to choose one and you're guaranteed, it would be the US.
Yes. A biggest challenge for India, is it Pakistan or China?
China. I say that in the book. So it's not even close.
And so one thing that you would want the world to learn from India.
Diversity. I don't think people outside India understand how diverse India is, whether it's food, whether it's culture, and how for most Indians it is seamless. Your neighbor speaks a different language, mother tongue at home. It's very common. Your classmates do. It's diversity.
Yes. My question would be one thing that India can learn from America, China, and Russia.
Would it be one thing from all three or one from each?
Or one thing from each, yeah.
Oof. China implementation, right? Getting things done. Russia be hard. I have the least experience with Russia, so I'm not sure I can answer that. The US, what is one thing they could learn from the US? And process. Process matters. And on many things, something doesn't always work, but the US is actually quite good at that.
Okay, sir. So I believe that process is something we can historically learn from the Americans, but in the present situation, it's a bit.
No, and it's exactly because the present situation processes are not working that it shows the importance of process. I mean, I put it differently: institutionalization, right? So, there are universities that are 400 years old. We know they'll exist in 100 years because of the way they're structured and institutionalized. Nobody knows most Americans don't know who the leader of most of their universities are. But I mean, that tells you something about the strength of the university rather than the individual running the university.
Yes, so that was quite interesting, sir. And we would like to thank you so much for joining us today. And I think that this conversation has been very wide ranging. So, and it's been deeply insightful. And I think it's been a real treat also because for us and also it would be for the viewers who would watch us because who are very interested in foreign policy and in diplomatic affairs. And I think we've covered everything from ancient strategies that we used to use to the emerging technologies and to the volatile international situation. And you've definitely helped us to sort of see how India is thinking, adapting, and how India should sort of move ahead to lead on the world stage. And I think that's what made this the most special is that we heard your strategic perspectives, but at the same time, we also got a glimpse of the person behind, learning your thought process and your lived experiences and how you entered into this field and also the spirit which sort of shapes your work. So, sir, we truly appreciate your time and your thoughts. Thank you so much, sir, once again. It was a pleasure and an honor to interact with you.
To all our listeners, thank you for tuning in. And don't forget to get a copy of Vishwa Shastra by our very own Dhruva Jaishankar ji. And as always, keep asking the big questions. Until next time, stay curious, stay engaged, and keep shaping the India story one question at a time.